Welcome, everyone. I'm Will Hansen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Women and the Revolutionary Age, or Las Mujeres y la Época Revolucionaria, with Zara Anas Hanslin, Sarah C. Chambers, and Patricia Galeana. We are grateful to the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, Chicago, for co-sponsoring this program. The Newberry Library inspires and supports research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry's reading rooms and exhibition galleries are now open to readers with no appointment necessary, Tuesday through Saturday. Our Rosenberg Bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday, and you can shop online at any time. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online classes, and our virtual and in-person public programs. I also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and present. Today's event is part of our project, Viva la Libertad, Forming More Perfect Unions Across the Americas, a series of free public programs taking place through next spring. These events bring together scholars, writers, artists, and community members to explore independence struggles across the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and to reflect on their legacies today. Looking back on the age of revolutions 200 years ago in Latin America and the United States, Viva la Libertad examines how new countries emerged from colonial rule, who gained freedom and who was left behind, and why so many are still fighting for liberty, racial justice, and democracy. Viva la Libertad is being coordinated by the Newberry in partnership with the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, Chicago, the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Institutos Justice and Leadership Academy, and Illinois Humanities. The project has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I will hand it over to Erica Erdely, academic coordinator at UNAM Chicago, who would like to say a few words.
Buen día, bienvenidos todos a este evento. Soy Erica Erdely, secretaria académica en UNAM Chicago, y es para mí un gran privilegio el poder colaborar con The Newberry Library en este programa Viva la Libertad, que ha ocurrido ya durante varios meses con una gran cantidad de eventos, y pues el evento del día de hoy en particular nos honra contar con la presencia de una de las académicas más destacadas de nuestra universidad, la historiadora Patricia Galeana, quien el día de hoy pues podrá entrar en diálogo con dos académicas de universidades en los Estados Unidos, con la intención de crear este diálogo entre las diferentes formas de entender la historia latinoamericana y americana en general desde México y desde los Estados Unidos. Con esta intención es que hemos colaborado con este programa, y pues les damos la bienvenida. Adelante, Will, con la presentación de nuestros participantes. Muchísimas gracias.
Thanks so much, Erica. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you are joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond. Our speakers today are coming to you from across the Americas, the ancestral and present-day lands of thousands of indigenous peoples. Here in Chicago, we acknowledge that the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations: the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Takiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. We are lucky to be joined today by three distinguished scholars to discuss how women played essential roles in the independence movements through the Western Hemisphere in the Age of Revolutions. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Zara Anas-Hanslin is Associate Professor of History and Art History at the University of Delaware. She previously taught at CUNY and at Columbia, where she co-chaired the Columbia Seminar in Early American History and Culture from 2011 to 2016. Anas-Hanslin received her PhD in the History of American Civilization at the University of Delaware in 2009, and has been awarded numerous fellowships and grants for her research. Her first book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, was the inaugural winner of the Library Company of Philadelphia's Biennial Book Prize in 2018, and a finalist for the 2017 Best First Book Prize from the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians. Dr. Anas-Hanslin has been a frequent guest on the Travel Channel show Mysteries at the Museum and served as material culture consult for Lin-Manuel Miranda's 2019 show, Hamilton, the Exhibition. You might have heard of that. Our second speaker will be Patricia Galeana, historian, researcher, and editor. Dr. Galeana holds a PhD in Latin American Studies from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, where she is professor in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. She has written 15 books, including La Correspondencia entre Benito Juárez y Margarita Maza, co-authored or edited 34 other volumes, and written extensively for academic journals, as well as newspapers and magazines. Dr. Galeana is the curator, founder, and director of El Museo de la Mujer, the Museum of Woman, in Mexico City, and a member of the board of directors of the International Association of Women's Museums. In 2017, she was awarded the Grand Order Victory of the Republic decoration by the President of Mexico. Our third speaker will be Dr. Sarah C. Chambers, professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She explores political culture, citizenship, law, and gender during Spanish America's transition from colonialism to independence. In her most recent book, Families in War and Peace, Chile from Colony to Nation, she considers the intersections between family and politics in both rhetoric and practice, exploring how men's and women's experiences of the independence war was shaped by kin ties and ideas about family, as well as the ways in which the leaders of the new Chilean state attempted to reestablish social order, in part through policies aimed at reuniting and supporting families. Her current research examines the migrations spurred by the wars of independence in South America. And with that, I will hand things over to Dr. Anas-Hanslin.
Thank you very much, both for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'd like to thank the Newbery and the other sponsors for funding this program. Funding the humanities is vitally important always, but I think now more than ever. So I'm delighted to be part of a public program that also happens to be transnational, hemispheric, and bilingual. And I wish I could say more than gracias in Spanish to you today, but I'm very pleased there's a translator here to make this a truly international experience. I wanted to start with this slide, which is not very international at all, because one of the things that I'd like to do to situate my brief talk today is to talk about the geography of revolution, not just because this is obviously one of the things that we're gathered here today to do, to cross geographic, or more properly, I think, geopolitical boundaries, artificial boundaries placed upon the land, by ideas about what we should do in terms of history, whether we should attack it by the parameters of a nation state, geopolitical entities of other sorts, or whether, in fact, we should look at histories of things like revolutions in a much broader context, geographically speaking, whether that be hemispheric, transatlantic, or even global histories that transcend, go beyond the nation state and its boundaries. And I'd like to start by thinking for a moment of the meaning of that word America and American in the subject of my talk today, which is the so-called American Revolution. And I think as colleagues who study Latin America and Canada would rightly say, residents of the United States tend to co-opt this word American as if it refers solely to residents of the current United States. And so I think that's maybe one of the things that we could start with. I'm beginning my talk about the so-called American Revolution, very much aware that the word American is just as loaded with multiple meanings as the word revolution. So perhaps we can talk about that a bit in the Q&A. And so today what I'm going to be focusing on is unfamiliar territory, both literally and geographically, figuratively speaking, when I speak about the American Revolution. And I'm really going to focus on the transatlantic dimensions of this war, which is not very often discussed when it comes to the groups I'm going to focus on today, which are pro-American rebels or patriots, as they're often called. So then why am I starting with this map, which is very much not international, transatlantic, or hemispheric in any way, shape, or form? I'm starting with it to make a point. When you Google the phrase map of the American Revolution, this is what comes up. And this is from a reputable source. This is a National Geographic map, and it probably looks pretty familiar, right? It is discussing the battles and where they take place in the war that we call the American Revolution. And as you'll see, it's very much grounded on the East Coast of the United States. And I don't have to tell people who are from Chicago that this is a very minimalizing viewpoint of the current United States. It's also a woefully lacking way to conceive of the geographic parameters of the American Revolution. Even if you stick within the bounds of the continental United States as it's currently defined, if you go west to the Mississippi, there's a raid by Patriot James Willing, sort of ne'er-do-well drunkard that Thomas Jefferson sent on a raid up and down the Mississippi River to confiscate Loyalist property and kidnap enslaved people and sell them down the river in what was then Spanish-controlled New Orleans. But even if we think about the broader parameters of the war outside of the continental United States, certainly to the British and French forces, our allies, the French, who fought this war, what you don't see on this map, south of this map, namely the Caribbean and its very lucrative sugar islands, were of much more concern to them than what was happening in this small geographic entity that you see here. And then also, even further off the map, which will be my focus today, there's lots going on across the Atlantic. Now, it's often said that the American Revolution was the inspiration, the sort of tipping point for what would become this so-called Age of Atlantic revolutions, revolutions that sprung up everywhere from France to Haiti to Mexico. Though if you ever want to hear the American Revolution downplayed for its importance, ask a historian of France where the Age of Atlantic revolution started, and I will guarantee their answer won't be America, it will be France. But be that as it may, one of the things that I'm here today is to share a bit of my current research project, which argues that the American Revolution was not just the starting point of this Age of Atlantic revolutions. It was an Atlantic revolution, properly speaking, in and of itself, a global civil war. In other words, this map gives us a woefully limited and inadequate sense of the geography of revolution. And this has had serious consequences over the year, not just in terms of the histories we tell about this era and its war and its aftermath, but also in terms of, I think, encouraging a certain nativism, a certain unwillingness to look beyond the geopolitical boundaries of the United States of America, and even more specifically, a bias towards the East Coast and its history as being of outsized importance and really privileged in the stories that we tell about the founding era of the United States. And last but not least, when you Google map of the American Revolution, I didn't Google battles, I Googled map of the American Revolution. What you come up with, though, is a map of the battles. And I think it's important to remember that revolutions are not just fought on battlefields. They're not just fought with weapons of war and the shedding of blood. They're fought in many other different ways. And what I'm going to look at today are some bios of interconnected people, mostly women, who all knew one another during the Revolutionary era, who all fought on behalf of the American Revolution and the Patriots, and did so not in this map and not on those battlefields, but across the Atlantic, in London itself, under the very nose of King George III. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start by talking, though, about a loyalist woman. Because when you don't look at rebels against the king, or patriots as they've been called since by certain people, This is an obvious fact. Historians have done wonderful work chronicling the diaspora of loyalists, Black and Indigenous people, enslaved and free, women as well as men, who chose not to side with the American rebels in the American Revolution, either because they were loyalists to the crown or just did not side with the United States and its politics. This woman is one of those. And it's easy to comprehend the loyalists as part of this global civil war, because many of them end up leaving the geographic confines of the continental United States. And certainly this woman did. This is Christian Barnes of Marlborough, Massachusetts, wife of merchant Henry Barnes. And this portrait is in the collections of the Hingham Historical Society in Massachusetts. Now, if you look closely at it, you'll see it has a very unsightly tear in it. This is not a bad conservation job. This is a bayonet through the heart of the portrait, very deliberately done by patriots who, after a series of unfortunate events targeting the loyalist Barneses for their politics, including the tarring and feathering of a horse, and holding Christian sort of hostage to make them dinner and host them at gunpoint in her own home, the Barneses fled Massachusetts much earlier than most loyalists did in 1775. And their portraits, when their house was confiscated and overrun by patriots, were symbolically skewered through the heart, and the house itself given over to the use of patriots Henry and Lucy Knox. Now, the Barneses fled, like many loyalists, to Canada and then to England, where they stayed till their deaths, impoverished and bitter about their circumstances. But what I'd like to talk about is that there's a whole history of transatlantic patriots, as well as these loyalists like Christian Barnes, whose stories we know better, and that they are oftentimes women or Black people, minority actors who, by the nature of their identity as minorities, are excluded from traditional roles of political or military power in the Revolution. And often these idiosyncratic rebels were much more cosmopolitan than the traditional leaders, men like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, two people who'd never left North America before the war began, right? Other than Washington's brief trip to Bermuda. And that women and minority figures like these patriots who experienced this transatlantic American Revolution weren't just confined to the East Coast, and they didn't just fight with guns and words. They had rebellious ideologies that were forged under the nose of King George in London itself. And they were people who didn't use muskets, rather they used gossip and espionage and wax museums and art, like the man who painted this portrait himself, to express their politics. So the man who painted this portrait, if I could have the next slide, please, is a man called Prince Dima, the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in what became the United States of America, and a truly cosmopolitan person who crossed the Atlantic more than once. And he was indelibly shaped by the women in his life, women like Christian Barnes, who held him in bondage along with his mother, Daphne, a woman who was born in Africa and stolen from there and sold to the ownership of the Barneses in Boston. And he and his mother, Daphne, lived with the Barnes family for all of Daphne's life until they fled from England. She stayed behind. And for the first part of Prince Dima's life, he was sold away from his mother by the Barnes family as a very small child, and then purchased back because Daphne really worked on the Barneses to do so. She wanted to be reunited with her son. And Christian Barnes saw some talent in him as a portrait painter. So much so that in 1771, the Barneses, with a lot of encouragement from Prince's mother, Daphne, sent him to London to train with prize-winning British artist Robert Edge Pine, himself rumored to be of African descent, who was a sort of irascibly egalitarian man with 5 daughters, 4 of whom were painters, who got in trouble during the American Revolution for his anti-British, pro-American art published as prints as well as paintings. And the painting on the left is by him, and it's of Britain's first woman historian, a very radically pro-American thinker herself, Catherine Macaulay. Now, he also was the person who trained Prince Dima when Prince Dima was in London. And Prince Dima, among other things, historians, not just me, but others as well, think painted this portrait of his fellow enslaved Bostonian, creative, brilliant thinker, Phillis Wheatley. And Phillis Wheatley ended up going to London as well the year after Prince Dima was there, because like Prince Dima, she could not get support for her artistry in Boston. Christian Barnes asked Prince Dima if he would train, asked John Singleton Copley rather, if he would train Prince Dima, and Copley said no because of his race. And similarly, Phillis Wheatley could not get her poems published in London, in Boston, but could get them published in London because of her race. Now, these two are a fascinating pair to consider together. Prince Dima, who was trained by the the man who painted that portrait of Catherine Macaulay on the left, and Phyllis Wheatley, because when you think about them in tandem, it really highlights, I think, these two people who are patriots eventually in the American Revolution. Phyllis Wheatley publishes patriotic poems, has a meeting with George Washington. Prince Dima, like his mother, stays behind when the Barneses flee Massachusetts for England, and enlists and actually fights in a Massachusetts regiment where Paul Revere is the second in command for the Patriots before sadly dying before the war is done. But both Wheatley and Dima couldn't get support for their creative artistry, even though it's patriotic in Boston itself. They have to go to London to get the outlet that they need. And London in some ways would have been a much better place for them, but they do go back to America, both of them, largely because of personal ties. And I think that they're two really poignant examples of the fact that Black patriots like Wheatley and Dima are so much more cosmopolitan, so much better traveled, have so much more potential genius in some ways than a lot of the white men that we celebrate as founders. And yet they both died very impoverished and unable to practice, for practical reasons, the art that they wanted to in America. So the last transatlantic patriotic woman I'd like to talk about today, if I could have the next slide, please, is a woman who was part of these overlapping circles in London that Prince Dima, Phyllis Wheatley, and Robert Edgepine all populated. And that's this woman here, Patience Wright, whom you see in another portrait by Robert Edgepine at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And you see here that she is posed with a sort of amorphous something on her lap under her gauzy apron. And this is because she was America's first Euro-American born woman sculptor, and she sculpted in wax. And she was famous in London, where she moved the year right before Phyllis Wheatley came, 1 year after Prince Dima, 1 year before Phyllis Wheatley. She became famous for her very theatrical way of sculpting wax heads. She would mold them under her skirts and then whip them out fully formed as if she'd given birth to them. So this shows her sort of taking a break from her idiosyncratic wax sculpting. Patience Wright came to London with the support of Benjamin Franklin, who was living there at the time in 1772. And she took London by storm. She had popular as well as royal patronage and acclaim. She modeled the heads of King George and Queen Charlotte. She also modeled a wax sculpture of Catherine Macaulay, the pro-American British historian. And she also had a wax sculpture in her very popular wax museum of Phyllis Wheatley's English patron, the Countess of Huntingdon. So in other words, all these people are connected through the art that they make and display in various and fascinating ways. And once blood begins to be shed, once the Battle of Lexington and Concord occurs in 1775, Patience Wright in London is really, her patriotism, her American patriotism is fired up. And she, according to popular gossip of the day, marched into King George and berated him to his face for the deaths of her compatriots in America. And if we go to the next slide, you can see this is a much better example of her making this head under her lap and then pulling up fully formed. This is a portrait of her in a popular London magazine of the day. After the battle, once the Lexington and Concord, once the war has begun, she turned her popular wax museum into a pro-American stage, essentially. You could go there and see figures like the one on the right, which is her only surviving full-length wax portrait. This is of William Pitt, Lord Chatham, the famous parliamentarian and pro-American British politician. She had this in her wax museum. She had statues of indigenous people in her wax museum in much the way that patriots co-opted figures of American Indians as their symbol of themselves to try to distance themselves from Britannia and from Britain. She did the same thing in her wax museum. She also used wax in other ways. And if you look at the image on the left, one of the things that she did was, before she put these heads onto their wooden bodies, and in some cases she never did, she sometimes would ship them across the Atlantic to her sister Rachel Wells, who operated a wax museum in Philadelphia. and she would hide notes in them because she practiced espionage during the war. Very ineffectual espionage, I should note, because often her letters to American leaders like Benjamin Franklin, who by then was in Paris, were intercepted by British officials and allowed to go on because the information in them was terrible. But nevertheless, she did attempt to maximize this, her position at the center of London society and politics, to spy for the American cause. And perhaps more effectually, the other thing that she did was she agitated throughout the war on behalf of the many hundreds of American prisoners of war who spent the prison in every place from the Tower of London to Newgate Prison to terrible prisons in Plymouth in England. And these, again, are patriots, including the second and third husbands of Betsy Ross and Patience Wright's own son-in-law, who spent their time as patriots languishing in England. So both these unwilling patriots had this transatlantic history to be told, and the willing patriots like Patience Wright, who spend the war in London itself, really give us a much broader concept of the geography of patriotism. And so one of the things that happens here is that these people are not given their due either during their time or in the histories that we tell since. When Patience Wright died, she was hoping to raise enough money to go back to America. She wanted to be the sort of wax modeler to the early Republican stars. She wanted to put together a wax museum with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all the founding father noteworthies. She died before she could do this, but she wanted her body to be sent back to America in that instance. And her sister, the other wax sculptor in the family, petitioned based on her sister's espionage activity, to be allowed to do this. And her petition was denied. Her sister had her own petition for money in which she said, and I think this is a wonderfully poignant quote about women in the American Revolution, she had done as much to carry on the war as many that sit now at the helm of government. And yet her petition was unsuccessful. And I think this is because neither sister fit official ideas about which types of patriots the young nation wanted to honor. Neither fit the parameters of a patriotic sacrifice that has been defined largely at the time period and since as government or military service. I think it's worth mentioning that some of the women who were granted pensions for military service during the war, for service during the war rather, were either the widows of soldiers or famously Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man in order they did get a pension. So what is the big takeaway here after this brief look at some of these transatlantic women of the American Revolution and some transatlantic patriots in whose lives women had outsized importance, like Prince Dima? I think that it really complicates the who, the where, and the how of the American Revolution. Because when most people think of American patriots, they still picture a white man writing a political pamphlet or leading a battle charge within the continental United States on that map that I showed you at the start. And this is despite a slew of wonderful recent scholarship complicating this era and its stories. But the fascinating truth is that there was this whole cast of noteworthy patriots who learned radical ideas and practiced rebellion in the very heart of the monarchy in London itself. And often to their ironic advantage, they could do so because they were minority figures like Patience Wright, like Prince Dima, women and Black people, often creative people who declared their independence with paint, canvas, wax, and wit. And their stories, I think, bring to life the fact that Revolutionary era America and patriotism itself, like the war, was much more cosmopolitan and expansive than many assume it to be today. And what might we not think of patriotism and who's allowed to participate in it if we were to revise our notions of it and see it as the truly transatlantic, transcending geopolitical boundaries, cosmopolitan, minority inclusive event that it was during the time itself. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Anasazlan. Dr. Galeana, would you like to go?
Sí, muchas gracias. Me da mucho gusto pues participar en este ciclo de las mujeres y la época revolucionaria y voy a compartir con ustedes una presentación. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer a mi universidad, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y su sede en Chicago, por esta invitación, así como a la Newberry Library de Chicago. Y yo voy a hablar de las mujeres insurgentes, que fueron las que participaron en el proceso de la independencia de México. De hecho, las mujeres han participado en todo el proceso de la construcción de todos los países del mundo, pero por mucho tiempo la historia de las mujeres no fue referida. Las mujeres no eran sujetos de la historia. Fue gracias al feminismo que empezó a estudiarse la historia de las mujeres, puesto que primero se estudió la historia política y como las mujeres no tenían el poder, pues solo ocasionalmente, cuando no había una sucesión masculina, pues llegaron al poder algunas reinas desde la historia europea. Y después viene la historia económica, cuando se empieza a estudiar a las trabajadoras, la historia social y cultural, y entonces se rescata el quehacer histórico de las mujeres. Y quise empezar mi presentación con este cuadro de Ángel Bolívar, que se encuentra en el Museo de la Mujer, en donde en los 60, cuando empieza la segunda ola del feminismo, Ángel Bolívar quiso reflejar la participación de las mujeres en todas las etapas de la historia de México, desde la época colonial con Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, en la independencia con Josefa Ortiz y Leona Vicario, en la revolución con las soldaderas y también el trabajo de las mujeres campesinas. El movimiento de independencia de México, como veremos en esta lámina, es un movimiento popular que, a diferencia de otros movimientos independentistas, fue encabezado en sus inicios por un cura de pueblo de la parroquia de Dolores, que era un cura heterodoxo, un cura que participaba de las ideas ilustradas francesas, conocía el proceso de la Revolución Francesa, también de la independencia en Estados Unidos, y este cura va con la red de miembros del bajo clero a desatar un movimiento popular en el que se da la participación de toda la población en general. No nada más se dan grandes batallas entre ejércitos formales, sino que él sale Hidalgo de Dolores con una docena de hombres, y cuando llega a Celaya, que es una población muy cercana, ya lo siguen 40,000 personas, obviamente entre hombres y mujeres. Aquí tenemos un collage hecho por la fotógrafa Lara Baca, que va a tomar el mural de Juan O'Gorman sobre la independencia y va a poner todas las caras de mujeres que le es posible para demostrar en este collage que las mujeres participaron activamente y que solamente algunas fueron recogidas por la historia. La historia de la independencia de México, para decirlo muy brevemente, es muy larga. Tiene su antecedente en la crisis de la monarquía española de 1808. Va a tener un movimiento armado de 11 años, de 1810 a 1821. Justo el día de ayer se cumplieron 200 años de que concluyó el movimiento armado, y después vinieron 15 años más de negociación diplomática en los que el Imperio Español primero permaneció en un islote cerca del puerto de Veracruz, en el Golfo de México, hasta 1825, y también tuvo un intento fallido de reconquista en 1829 y finalmente reconoce la independencia de México hasta 1836. Cabe destacar que por estas características particulares, el movimiento de independencia de México va a tener como principal divisa desde su inicio la abolición de la esclavitud, que se va a dar en 1810. El único otro lugar donde se había abolido la esclavitud antes fue en Haití en 1804. Y esto va a hacer que los antiguos esclavos y esclavas, las castas, todos los grupos indígenas se sumen al movimiento de independencia que, como quiero hacer énfasis, es un movimiento popular, es una revolución popular. Por lo tanto, hay miles de mujeres cuyos nombres pues se han perdido en el anonimato por su dimensión, porque no hay documentos que den cuenta de su acción, pero fueron las que acompañaban a los insurgentes, los alimentaban, los curaban, pero también eran espías y correos, y algunas tomaron las armas y fueron, como lamentablemente en todas las guerras, también un botín, y muchas fueron violadas, encarceladas o ejecutadas por el ejército realista para someter a la insurgencia. Aquí está el epígrafe de una de las mujeres insurgentes que reclama su derecho a luchar por la libertad de su patria, considerando que siendo mexicana esto es una obligación. Ella fue Luisa Martínez, hizo esta declaración antes de ser ejecutada por los realistas en 1817. Sin embargo, hay algunas mujeres que fueron consignadas por los primeros cronistas, por los primeros historiadores que dieron cuenta de la revolución de independencia de México. Y pues en un mundo de hombres, ellas lograron trascender. Entre estos nombres destacan Josefa Ortiz, Leona Vicario, Mariana Rodríguez del Toro, Gertrudis Bocanegra o María Ignacia Rodríguez de Velasco Osorio y Barba, mejor conocida como la Güera Rodríguez. Las mujeres que fueron recuperadas por la historiografía, muchas de ellas desde el tiempo en que todavía vivían, eran mujeres de élite, eran mujeres de la clase alta que abandonaron su situación privilegiada para unirse a la guerra insurgente. Y como escribe María Josefa Guilebardi en este texto, pues ellas consideraban que en la independencia ellas deberían de participar también en la toma de decisiones, puesto que como todo ser viviente, pues tenían inteligencia para ello. Hablemos de la importancia de Josefa Ortiz. Josefa Ortiz, pues fue una mujer, como decía yo, de clase alta. Estudió en el Colegio de las Vizcaínas. Es el primer colegio que se crea en la Nueva España en el siglo XVIII, en donde había una enseñanza un tanto independiente de la Iglesia Católica, y conoce a su esposo, que se va a convertir después en el corregidor de Querétaro. Perdón. Esta mujer participó activamente en las conspiraciones que se dieron cuando vino la represión al movimiento pacífico de autonomía que buscaron los criollos en 1808. Cabe destacar que la organización de la Sociedad Novohispana era una organización basada en el origen racial. Entonces, arriba de toda la pirámide social se encontraban los peninsulares. En los cargos más importantes, el virrey, los miembros de la audiencia, que eran los encargados de impartir justicia, pues justamente venían desde España. Y ahí hay que señalar, y aquí quiero hacer una mención. Puedo ir más rápido, pero es que mi antecesora, la doctora Sara, tuvo 20 minutos. Entonces, por eso estaba yo yendo con más calma. Esto se lo digo a Will porque me acaba de poner un mensaje en el que me dice que yo vaya más rápido, pero pues estoy tomando el tiempo que se le dio a la doctora Sara, que me antecedió, porque creía yo que los tiempos iban a ser iguales para todas las participantes y que no iba a haber algunas que tuvieran más tiempo y otras menos tiempo. Pero pues voy a abreviar. Estaba yo tratando de explicar cuál era el proceso independentista, pero me voy a ir más rápido. Puedo hacerlo, tengo la experiencia para hablar exactamente los 7 minutos que se nos había pedido originalmente. Estaba yo señalando que Josefa Ortiz fue una mujer preparada que participó en las conspiraciones y aquí ya se pensó en que como había sido reprimido el intento pacífico de los criollos, así llamados los que nacían en el territorio mexicano, no venían de la península, y al ser reprimido, repito, este movimiento pacifista, pues entonces se planea la guerra. Y la importancia que tiene Josefa Ortiz es que logra avisar a Miguel Hidalgo de la orden de aprehensión que iba a haber en su contra. Y gracias a esto, pues pudo lograr el inicio del movimiento y no ser aprehendido. Aquí les había yo puesto otro párrafo que, como ya me han cortado mi exposición, ya no voy a leer, lo podrán leer ustedes, en el que se da una denuncia pues de Beristain y Sousa, que era un clérigo importante de la época novohispana, acusando a Josefa Ortiz de que era una Ana Bolena, porque era una seductora que no perdía ocasión para hablar en contra del rey de España y a favor de la independencia. Josefa Ortiz no tuvo no quiso aceptar ningún reconocimiento en vida, y cuando ella muere, pues va a haber diversas pues declaraciones como benemérita de la patria. En Querétaro se le hace una escultura y también en la Ciudad de México. Los primeros insurgentes van a ser tomados, la siguiente por favor, van a ser ejecutados a los 4 meses de haber iniciado el movimiento, y entonces hay una mujer que destaca porque llama a que se aprenda al virrey y se canjee su vida por la de Miguel Hidalgo. Aquí está su exhorto, las personas que hablan español lo podrán leer, yo ya no lo voy a leer para concluir a la brevedad. Y esta conspiración pues fue denunciada porque uno de los conspiradores temió por su vida, decidió irse a confesar y pues el cura que le confesó, violando pues el secreto que debía tener la confesión, lo denunció y de esta forma Mariana Rodríguez del Toro fue encarcelada y estuvo encarcelada desde 1811 hasta que termina la guerra. Otra mujer destacada de las que había yo mencionado en mi introducción fue Leona Vicario. Leona Vicario colaboró, era también mujer de élite, de muchos recursos, y colaboró con la organización clandestina de los Guadalupes, donó pues sus recursos a la insurgencia, fue apresada, pero logró escapar y se unió a las huestes de Morelos, que fue el continuador, era un alumno, también cura de Hidalgo, y fue el que llevó a su culminación al movimiento de independencia e incluso dio la primera constitución al país en 1814. Leona Vicario es la heroína más reconocida. Ella no solamente destacó en su apoyo a la insurgencia, llevó la imprenta para que pudieran hacer su periódico, sino que sostuvo, terminada la independencia, una polémica con Lucas Alamán, uno de los personajes más destacados de la época, que fue varias veces ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, defendiendo a su género de pues cómo había luchado por su patria, ya que Lucas Alamán decía que las mujeres se habían incorporado a la lucha solamente por acompañar a sus maridos o a sus novios. Y ella habla de los deseos de gloria y libertad que son más desinteresados en las mujeres. Ella ha sido reconocida como madre de la patria y sus restos están depositados en la columna de la independencia. Otra mujer, y ya prácticamente voy a terminar, Will, para que no te preocupes, fue la Güera Rodríguez, que ha sido muy discutida últimamente porque según una investigación que se acaba de publicar, no hay documentos que prueben su participación en el movimiento independentista. Sin embargo, pues nos parece suficiente prueba que fuera llamada por la Inquisición para responder a cargos que se le hacía por estar conspirando contra el gobierno. Después ella fue el enlace entre Agustín de Iturbide, que es el militar criollo que va a negociar el fin de la guerra, y por esto es que también está recogida en las diversas historias sobre la independencia de México. Para concluir, en la siguiente página, quisiera yo nada más señalar que hay muchísimas mujeres que ofrendaron su vida por la independencia. Entre ellas se puede mencionar a Gertrudis Bocanegra y tantas otras que fueron ejecutadas por negarse a delatar a sus compañeros de lucha. Lamentablemente, consumada la independencia, la vida de las mujeres no cambió sustancialmente cuando concluyó la independencia, sino que fue hasta la reforma liberal de mediados del siglo XIX, cuando se liquidaron las supervivencias del viejo régimen colonial y la mujer empezó a estudiar las mismas materias que estudiaban los hombres y no nada más la educación religiosa de rezos y del catecismo que memorizaban, sino que al triunfo de la reforma liberal se va a crear las escuelas mixtas, después la escuela secundaria para mujeres y de ahí empezarán a llegar a la universidad a finales del siglo XIX y después encabezarán pues movimientos en la lucha por la Revolución Social de 1910 y por el sufragio y todos los derechos de las mujeres. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Well, I'd like to thank the Newberry, UNAM, my fellow panelists, and all of you who have tuned in today. For 200 years since South American countries became independent, attention to women is usually limited to praising a few heroines. Although better than no acknowledgement at all, putting women up on a pedestal treats them as two-dimensional rather than as historical actors in their full complexity. I'll organize my remarks around the questions of, did women mobilize for reasons related to gender? Did they mobilize as women? And how did the condition of women change or not after the revolution? The wars that resulted in independence for the countries of South America took place after Napoleon's invasion of Spain provoked an imperial crisis in 1810. But revolts against the crown had been increasing since the 18th century during that age of revolution. One of the largest began in Cusco in 1780, spread for 2 years across the Andes, and was largely indigenous in composition. The rebellion is known by the name its leader took, that of the last Inca emperor executed by the Spanish 2 centuries earlier, Tupac Amaru, pictured here. A recent book, however, consistently attributes leadership to both Tupac Amaru and his wife, Micaela Bastidas. Bastidas became a leader because she shared that movement's goals of lifting colonial burdens of taxation and forced labor from the indigenous population, so not for reasons related to her gender. Her leadership role was rooted in complementary gender relations within indigenous society. She took particular responsibility for provisioning the troops and gathering intelligence, but also recruited allies, threatened adversaries, and gave advice on military strategy. According to one witness held prisoner in the rebel camp, quote, "I saw more rebelliousness in Micaela to the point that she was to be feared more than her husband," end quote. Spanish authorities similarly recognized her critical role, and when they were victorious, meted out similarly gruesome executions to both Tupac Amaru and Bastidas. Next slide, please. The Andes were not completely isolated from events in the Atlantic world, as referenced by the first panelist, but this rebellion emerged principally out of local conditions and took the unique form of a neo-Inca revival. And these are some of the books and portraits of that time period. Next slide. On the Atlantic side of the continent, the examples of the US, French, and Haitian revolutions did have greater impact and spurred several revolts among the enslaved population beginning in the late 18th century. Research on the roles of women in such movements has been scarce and the sources are limited. Nonetheless, reports of Black queens suggest that women who voted and held positions of authority in African descent associations known as nations were active in these revolts. Like indigenous rebels, they would have been fighting for the same reason as men, for freedom from enslavement. Indigenous and African descent women and men would continue to participate in the wars of independence that began in 1810. But the leaders of these movements were largely men from the Spanish settler elite. Next slide, please. One of the most famous was Simón Bolívar, who rose to head armies that not only liberated his native Venezuela, but extended the fight across the continent. As was true of most revolutionary leaders across the Americas in this era, Bolívar did not imagine that women might become full-fledged citizens in these new republics. Nevertheless, he valued their contributions to the cause. His romantic partner and political ally, Manuela Sáenz, on the next slide, is often depicted only in relationship to Bolívar, somewhat like Leona Victoria protesting that we weren't just girlfriends and wives, right? But she had become active in the cause before meeting him, against the wishes of her husband, an English merchant, and she continued her involvement after his death. Highly regarded by others and awarded the Order of the Sun, pictured here, she built networks and alliances by hosting meetings and carrying on a prolific correspondence as she traveled throughout the territory that would become later the nations of Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, asserting, quote, getting back to the beginning of our presentations, "My country is the continent of America." So she took that broad view of America. Next slide, please. Another important woman in Bolívar's life, his eldest sister, Maria Antonia, was active on the opposite side. Despite patriot orders threatening with execution anyone who collaborated with the royalists, she protected Spaniards on her Venezuelan estate. High-ranking royal magistrates later testified to her services, indicating that her contemporaries had no qualms admitting that they benefited from her protection rather than depicting her as a vulnerable woman in need of their protection. Once independence was secured, Maria Antonia returned from exile in Spanish Cuba and reconciled with her brother. Despite their differences, for example, he advocated for the abolition of slavery while she supported its continuation, Simón relied upon her to manage his finances and for news from Venezuela while he was out on campaign across the continent. He urged her, quote, "Always send me political and all other news because what you tell me is always the most correct." Manuela Sáenz and Maria Antonia Bolívar, like other women, chose a side in the independence conflict based upon their own political views and position in the social order, not because they were fighting for rights as women. The roles they took on, however, were shaped by their gender to some degree. South American women in this era did not publish manifestos and rarely made speeches, but they were influential in social circles where ideas were discussed in salons or through correspondence. They were also critical to espionage efforts, as in Mexico. While elite women wrote letters, working class women were often the couriers. Next slide, please. Colombia's most famous heroine, seamstress Policarpa Salvarrieta, listened to conversations as she sewed dresses in royalist households and passed along the intelligence to rebel forces, an act for which she was executed. Women were also spies on the other side. Next slide. Chileans rebels prohibited the carrying of correspondence across enemy lines. And one officer declared, quote, "The enemy has sustained its espionage, inflicting incalculable evils upon the Republic by means of the women," end quote. Women's wartime contributions rarely extended to combat. Next slide. But like all pre-modern armies, including the Mexican one, troops relied upon women to keep soldiers fed and clothed, as well as nurse the sick and the wounded. Most historians have portrayed women's place in Latin American society as relegated to the private sphere both before and after independence, despite their participation in those movements, which is seen as a brief blip. I see the trajectory somewhat differently. Women and men were far from equal in Latin America before independence, but they shared the status of royal subjects, and class and race were often more important than gender in determining women's status. The transition to republics, however, sharpened gender distinctions. While even some men of lower social and racial status could claim citizenship based upon their military service, all women were excluded from formal participation in politics. Women like Sáenz and Bolívar did not identify primarily with their domestic roles, but by the middle of the 19th century, women were encouraged to aspire only to be virtuous mothers, raising future citizens. Such an ideal was a demotion for elite women and impossible to live up to for most women of color. Thank you. That ends my remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. And thanks to Dr. Anas-Hanslin and Dr. Galeana for your presentations as well. We had 3 very rich presentations to draw upon here. And I'm afraid we're out of time for questions and answers, but I hope the attendees will join me in thanking our 3 presenters. There's so much to talk about with this topic that there's never enough time. So thanks again to Doctors Anas-Hanslin, Chambers, and Galeana. And again, our special thanks to UNAM Chicago and to the National Endowment for the Humanities for sponsoring this program. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need your support of our entire community. So please support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. And you can see that address here. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry for some public programs in the fall. In the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program, this year's Darcy McNichol Distinguished Lecture Series with Deborah McGregor, who will speak on storytelling, climate justice, and self-determined Indigenous futures. This event will take place on Thursday, October 7th at 6 p.m. Central Time. And the next Newberry in-person program will be Through the Flames and Beyond, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire on Friday, October 8th, 2021, from 6:30 to 7:15 p.m. on the front steps of the Newberry Library. That will be an outdoor program. So you can register for these and other programs on our website, www.newberry.org. Thank you.